السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك وأنعم على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي نبي الرحمة وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اهتدى بهديه وانتهج نهجه إلى يوم الدين. تركنا المحجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزيغ عنها إلا هالك. ثم أما بعد، أسعد الله أوقاتكم ونور قلوبكم بعين الإيمان والإسلام والإحسان، وجعل هذا الشهر المبارك شهر الكريم وشهر الغفران وشهر الرحمة وشهر العتق من النار، إنه ولي ذلك والقادر عليه. بارك الله فيكم. May Allah bless you all. Alhamdulillah, we are into the 4th or 5th day of Ramadan, and this blessed month already is going by quite quickly, and so it's always a reminder that we make the best of our time while we have it, while Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accords us the gift of life and the gift of time and the gift of health, and that we use those things in the best measure possible by being grateful and using them in the way that they were intended to be used by our Lord Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we're going to look at the 5th juz today, or the 5th part from 30 parts, and this coincides with Surah An-Nisa, so the surah that is named after the women, and the end of the 4th juz also began with Surah An-Nisa. And I'm just going to look at one verse back, because it's one of those odd points where the first verse of the juz 5 is directly related to the first verse of, or last verse of juz 4. And Surah An-Nisa is, for people who memorize Surah An-Nisa, they usually make the claim that it's a difficult surah to memorize because it has a lot of ahkam, a lot of rulings. So rulings dealing with An-Nisa, legal rulings dealing with things that were specific to Arabia in the 7th century, such as dealing with bondmen and bondmaiden, things that were specific to the Medinian society and the relationship with the Jewish tribes in Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara. So this surah, Surah An-Nisa, is Madaniyah. It's a Medinian surah, and it was revealed after the Prophet ﷺ emigrated to Al-Madinah. And at the end, we will also see some of those relationships as they deal with at-tahkim, how the Prophet ﷺ not only acted as prophet and messenger for the Medinian society, but also de facto ruler of the Medinian society, and his relationship with all of the disparate and different communities and groups who lived in Medina at the time. But first, let's look at this last verse from Surah, from the previous juz, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, after أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم حرمت عليكم أمهاتكم وبناتكم وأخواتكم وعماتكم وخالاتكم وبنات الأخ وبنات الأخت أمهاتكم اللاتي أرضعنكم وأخواتكم من الرضاعة وأمهات نسائكم وربائبكم اللاتي في حجوركم من نسائكم اللاتي دخلتم بهن فإن لم تكونوا دخلتم بهن فلا جناح عليكم وحلائل أبنائكم الذين من أصلابكم أن تجمعوا بين الأختين إلا ما قد سلف إن الله كان غفورا رحيما. So that's the last verse, and then the first verse of juz 5, وَالْمُحْصَنَاتُ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ. So that's ma'tuf, or a conjunction with waw, directly related to the tahrim that came in the previous verse. So one of the things that we can point out here from a linguistic and also foundational principle of juristic reasoning is that the jurists look at the Quran in terms of derivation of rulings roughly along two broad lines, something called al-mantuq and something called al-mafhum. So al-mantuq is that which is stated explicitly and verbally within the words themselves of the Quran. And then the mafhum is that which can be understood via the language of the Quran. So if we look at this verse here, for example, حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمْ أُمَّهَاتُكُمْ, the first part. حُرِّمَتْ means it has been made forbidden to you, has been made haram to you, your mothers. أُمَّهَاتُكُمْ وَبَنَاتُكُمْ, and your daughters, وَأَخَوَاتُكُمْ, and your sisters, وَعَمَّاتُكُمْ, and your paternal aunts, وَخَالَاتُكُمْ, and your maternal aunts, وَبَنَاتُ الْأَخِ وَبَنَاتُ الْأُخْتِ, and your nieces, what are they from? Your sisters, or from your brothers. أمهاتكم اللاتي أرضعنكم, and those who are mothers by way of رضاعة, by way of suckling. وأخواتكم من الرضاعة, and those who would be your brothers and sisters by way of, or sisters obviously, by way of رضاعة. وأمهات نسائكم وربائبكم, and the mothers of your wives. وربائبكم, and the daughters of your wives who are not from you, obviously, or from a previous marriage. اللاتي في حجوركم من نسائكم, the ones who are with you from your own wives. اللاتي دخلتم بهن, the ones that you have consummated the marriage with. So there's a slight difference of ruling between consummation of marriage between the mothers and the daughters. So if you consummate the marriage in Islam with, in other words, a daughter who has a mother, you can then not marry the mother if you have consummated, if you have even done the aqd and nikah, if you have done the marriage contract. Whereas if you have not consummated the marriage with a mother and then you want to marry the daughter afterwards, and there's no consummation, then one is allowed to do so. And that's by the ijma' of the ulama. And that's what that part, the next part of the verse, فَإِن لَمْ تَكُونُوا دَخَلْتُمْ بِهِنَّ فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْكُمْ. That's with al-ummahat. وَحَلَائِلُ أَبْنَائِكُمْ, and the wives of your sons and also grandsons. الَّذِينَ مِنْ أَصْلَابِكُمْ, the ones who are your own sons from your blood. وَأَن تَجْمَعُوا بَيْنَ الْأُخْتَيْنِ, and to marry two sisters at the same time. وَقِيَاسًا عَلَى ذَلِكَ, the ulama said also to marry an aunt and a niece at the same time. In other words, have them as co-wives. إِلَّا مَا قَدْ سَلَفَ, except that's what came before the tahrim of this verse. إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ غَفُورًا رَحِيمًا, Allah is most forgiving and most merciful. So what I was talking about earlier, al-mantuq wal-mafhum, so here it just says حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمْ. It didn't say explicitly حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمْ تَزْوِيجُهُم. It didn't say explicitly that it's forbidden to marry them, but it's understood from the mafhum or the context of the verse, because it's talking about relationships with women, obviously speaking to the men here, and the reverse is true. It can be speaking to the women, and those men also would be haram to marry. And it didn't state explicitly that. Whereas in the verse that comes in Surah Al-Ma'idah, that will come later, that talks about the tahrim of things that are to eat, and it talks about the tahrim of lahm al-khinzir, and certain types of animals, they die in a particular way, وَمَا اسْتُقْسِمُ عَلَى الْأَزْلَامِ, and they use divining arrows to slaughter upon. All of those things are haram, and yet it's the same word, حُرِّمَتْ. But it didn't say eating their flesh, but it's understood from the context. And so this is important, because the mafhum in the Quran is a lot. There are many, many instances, and they said in as many words there are in the Quran, the 6,000 plus, there are also as many instances of mafahim, things that can be inferred and understood from the words of the Quran itself. And then the first verse of Juz 5, وَالْمُحْصَنَاتُ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ فَهَذَا مَعْطُوف عَلَى حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمْ. So it's connected to حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمْ. So also made haram upon you, وَالْمُحْصِنَاتِ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ إِلَّا مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ. And also women who are already married. Obviously, you can't marry them, but here that may have been a practice of the pre-Islamic Arabs, and the Quran is obviously making that haram. So the muhsan or al-muhsana or al-muhsanatu, those who have been or are still in a marital relationship. إِلَّا مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ, except for those that come into bondage with you. So this is something that applied to a particular time when there were wars that were being fought, and husbands and of the opposing armies were being killed. So in this instance, or they were being imprisoned or taken as prisoners of war, then many of the ulama considered that marriage contract to be null and void as soon as they are taken by the Muslims, in whatever case that may be. Kitab Allahi alaykum, something that has been written by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or prescribed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَحِلَّ لَكُمْ مَا وَرَاءَ ذَلِكُمْ أَن تَبْتَغُوا بِأَمْوَالِكُمْ مُحْسِنِينَ غَيْرَ مُسَافِحِينَ. And then anything that is not mentioned here explicitly, then it is halal for people to enter into a marital relationship with. And this also points to the usuli concept that al-aslu fil ashya al-ibaha, that things generally are considered to be all permissible unless there is a specific command, a specific verse, a specific hadith, or a specific understanding from the Quran and Sunnah that says otherwise. So, الدليل على المدعي, as they say, الدليل على المدعي. Someone who claims that something is haram, قُلْ هَاتُوا بُرْهَانَكُمْ. Bring your proof from the Quran and from the Sunnah that is haram. Otherwise, you don't have to bring proof that something is halal if it's not otherwise explicitly stated that it is haram. Wallahu a'lam. So, I want to skip ahead to a verse after these verses that deal with some of these relationships between men and women, especially in bondage that we talked about lightly or briefly. يقول الله تعالى يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل إلا أن تكون تجارة عن تراض منكم ولا تقتلوا أنفسكم إن الله كان بكم رحيما. Oh, you who believe. So whenever you see this type of verse, يا أيها الذين آمنوا, then it's applying to the believers. And a lot of the time, these type of verses are talking about ahkam, talking about legal rulings. And based upon that, the ulama also have a healthy discussion about, do the furu'a of the sharia, do the specific legal rulings, are they addressed to Muslims and non-Muslims alike or only to Muslims? So one group says that they are only addressed to Muslims, and that means that the people of the book and people who are not Muslim are not mukhatab, they're not addressed by the ahkam of Islam, and they have their own ahkam. And another group said no, they're all included in that, and that they also be taken into task for not following the ahkam al-Islam. And the dalil that they use is the verse قال ما سلككم في سقر قالوا لم نكن من المصلين ولم نكن نطعم المسكين وكنا نخوض مع الخائضين. So when the believers were asked, the disbelievers in hellfire, what has brought you to hellfire? ما سلككم في سقر قالوا لم نكن من المصلين. We were not from the people who prayed. وَلَمْ نَكُنْ نُطْعِمُ الْمِسْكِينَ. And we didn't feed the hungry or the poor. وَكُنَّا نَخُوضُ مَعَ الْخَائِدِينَ. And we engage in frivolous things like with the people of frivolity. So that's an indication that they too are mukhatab, or they too are addressed with these verses. And each one has their dalil. Wallahu a'lam ila as-sawab. And we say that this is something that there's no practical fruit of the khilaf itself, of the difference of opinion. It's something that is only about the akhirah. And that always is the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala anyway. So anyway, this verse is saying, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تَأْكُلُوا أَمْوَالَكُمْ بَيْنَكُمْ بِالْبَاطِلِ. So this أكل الأموال بالباطل, it's a metaphor because it literally means don't eat each other's wealth by way of invalidity. And what it's saying is, do not usurp wealth, do not usurp anyone's property or anyone's money or assets in an invalid manner. So implicitly understood from this verse is amwalakum, like your property, your money. So Islam recognizes the right of people to have private property and to have individual rights to that property, and that it remains with them in their house, it remains in their possession until it is either sold, or it is passed on via inheritance, or it is loaned out, but then the loan has specific properties. Like the asset doesn't belong to the person who's the loanee, but they are getting the benefit of the asset and not the asset itself. Or they can gift it away, they can give it in charity, they can make it a waqf. This is another type of financial transaction. In other words, they make it part of an endowment that then will go towards a particular cause that they stipulate, and so forth. So no one can be dispossessed of their wealth except by lawful means. And this verse clearly states that here. يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تَأْكُلُوا أَمْوَالَكُمْ بَيْنَكُمْ بِالْبَاطِلِ إِلَّا أَن تَكُونَ تِجَارَةً عَنْ تَرَاضٍ مِّنْكُمْ. So this word illa also is interesting, except. So if you were to read this verse at face value and not understand some of the other meanings associated with illa, you would read it as, oh, you who believe, do not usurp each other's wealth by ways of invalidity, except for a running business between you that you are contented with. And then you might say, oh, so that means if we're doing a business together, we can do all sorts of illegal things. And that's not the case. Sometimes illa comes with the meaning of lakin. Lakin means في اللغة العربية الاستدراك. So it means, but rather do this. But rather do this. And this is jaiz. This is permissible in the Arabic language. So the meaning then becomes, don't usurp each other's wealth by way of invalidity, but rather, if you have a running business that is based upon taradin minkum, At-taradi. So taradi means that both parties are agreeable to the transaction. And with this, Imam Malik radiallahu anhu took this as his madhab. So he did not require a formal offer and acceptance in order for a financial transaction to take place. Unlike it said the Shafi'iyya, for example, the Shafi'iyya scholars, they said there had to be a formal offer of acceptance that would be verbal or otherwise understood. But for Imam Malik, he said, mujarrad al-taradi. Taradi means that there is an agreement between you. So it could be as simple as you hand someone the money, they give you the merchandise and you leave, and then it's understood that there's an agreement, even if that person is acting as an agent of the seller, like in a common convenience store, or if you're buying something on the internet. Obviously, you're not dealing with a human being directly, but you have all the indications of taradi, right? Taradi means they are contented with the transaction. And obviously, also the transaction has to be legal. So it cannot be something that has what's called a level of uncertainty that's unacceptable. And uncertainty means I sell you something before I actually possess it. So I can't sell you fish in the sea before I've actually fished them, because then it turns into a different type of transaction. That becomes an illegal transaction. So in addition to riba, many Muslims know about riba and paying things and paying a fa'idah or an interest above and beyond the value of the loan, but there are other types of unlawful transactions as well. So anything that has a level of uncertainty, that is unacceptable. Collateral has to be used in a particular way. فَرِهَانٌ مَقْبُوضَةٌ. So the rihan or the collateral has to be something that becomes in the possession of the creditor, not of the debtor, and transactions like that. So very actually complicated, a little bit and complex if you study the books of fiqh, but the usul, the foundational principles, are found obviously in the Quran and in the Sunnah. Then a verse later, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إن تجتنبوا كبائر ما تنهون عنه نكفر عنكم سيئاتكم وندخلكم مدخلا كريما ولا تتمنوا ما فضل الله به بعضكم على بعض للرجال نصيب مما اكتسبوا وللنساء نصيب مما اكتسبن واسألوا الله من فضله إن الله كان بكل شيء عليما. إن تجتنبوا, if you avoid كبائر. So here this word kaba'ir, which is the plural of kabira, and the kabira is the major sin, and the saghira is the minor sin. And they both fall under the category of as-sayyi'at or al-atham. So the sayyi'ah wal-ithim are types of sins, or the broad category of sins. Then they can be further divided into al-kabira wal-saghira. Ma hiya al-kaba'ir? What are these major sins? Different opinions amongst the ulama. Sayyidina Ibn Abbas, Turjuman al-Quran, he said that anything that is mentioned with a wa'id or a la'an in the Quran or in the Sunnah, something that has a specific threat or of a chastisement for, or a type of la'an or a type of damnation or cursing upon the person who incurs such a sin, then this is considered a kabira. And the Prophet ﷺ also said, اتقوا السبع الموبقات. The Prophet ﷺ said, avoid the 7 deadly sins, as it were. And this includes obviously shirk billah, black magic, unlawful killing, usury, riba, taking the money of an orphan illegally, to run away from the enemy in battle, and also to falsely accuse of adultery. So those 7 were concluded as the 7 deadly sins, and some of them added other things as well to those. Wallahu a'lam. And the understanding of Ahl Sunnah is that the kabira is generally not included in those divine acts of worship that expiate sins. So when the Prophet ﷺ talks about from the Jum'ah to the Jum'ah, from the Friday to the Friday, from the prayer to the prayer, or that your wudu expiates the sins of what was incurred by the limbs, these are generally referring to as-sayyi'at or as-sagha'ir, the minor sins. Major sins, however, require a specific tawbah, a specific istighfar and forgiveness, and returning back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to expiate them. Then the question becomes, what if someone dies in that state and they never made tawbah for that particular sin? Is it incumbent upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to chastise them and to not forgive them? Not necessary, Allahu a'lam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can choose, يَغْفِرُ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ. So we understand that verse, على الإطلاق. Al-itlaq means in an absolute sense. without any qualification. يَغْفِرُ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says another part also in this juz that إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَغْفِرُ مَنْ يُشْرَكَ بِهِ وَيَغْفِرُ مَا دُونَ ذَلِكَ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ. Allah will not forgive the ones who makes ishrak, shirk billah, associates partners with Allah, which basically is not believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَيَغْفِرُ دُونَ ذَلِكَ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ. But He will forgive anything less than that from whom He pleases. So this is a clear indication that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can forgive the major sins even though you don't have a tawbah. But there's also a command in the Quran that says, "Tubu ya ayyuhalladhina amanu tubu ila Allahi jami'a." Everyone has to make their tawbah. Everyone should return to, or should be in a state of returning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's the meaning of at-tawwabin. Inna Allah yuhibbu at-tawwabin wal-mutatahhirin. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves those who are in a constant state of returning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wal-mutatahhirin, and those who are in a constant state of purifying their hearts before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this verse is saying, لا إن تجتنبوا كبائر ما تنهون عنه. So if you avoid the kaba'ir, ما تنهون عنه, that you have been prohibited from, نكفر عنكم سيئاتكم. Then we will expiate your sayyi'at here, meaning the minor sins or the smaller sins. So there are many, many ways for smaller sins to get expiated. This is another one. That if you avoid the major sins, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will overlook the minor things that you do. وَنُدْخِلْكُمْ مُدْخَلًا كَرِيمًا. And we will enter you into this mudkhal, a place of entrance that is generous, that is kareem, which is Jannah. رزقنا الله ذلك إن شاء الله. May Allah give us that. وَلَا تَتَمَنَّوْا مَا فَضَّلَ اللَّهُ بِهِ بَعْضَكُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. And do not wish for that which Allah has given or preferred for others and not for yourself. And it said that sabab nuzul hadhi al-ayah, that Sittina Sauda, who was one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, she had stated or made the remark that the men are able to participate in battle and they're able to defend Al-Madinah and to defend us, and they have certain things that they'll get accolades and rewards for, like the Salat al-Jama'ah in the mosque and so forth. And as women, we don't have a nasib of this. We don't have an allotment of this. So this verse was revealed. وَلَا تَتَمَنَّوْا مَا فَضَّلَ اللَّهُ بِهِ بَعْضَكُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ لِلرِّجَالِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا اكْتَسَبُوا. For the men, they will have an allotment of that which they have earned. وَلِلنِّسَاءِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا اكْتَسَبْنَ. And women also have allotment for what they have earned. وَاسْأَلُوا اللَّهَ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. And ask Allah of His fadl, of His bounty, of His favor. إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمًا. For verily Allah is well acquainted and knows all things. So there is no difference between men and women in terms of taklif, in terms of the khitab al-sharia, the address of the sharia to all of them equally. However, Islam does understand different roles for different people. So a mother, for example, has a different role than a sister, than a daughter. So in her capacity as a mother, she has a certain role towards her children. And in her capacity as a daughter, she has a certain role towards her parents. And in her capacity as a wife, she has a certain role towards her husband and her family. So with each of these roles comes rights and responsibilities. So responsibilities in a sense, things that you have to deliver, and also rights that you're entitled to. So it's not about the difference in gender and difference between male and female per se, but it's about the different roles that are assigned. And so for any society and community to function properly, each one member of society will have to assume their particular roles in a manner that will ensure the sustainability and also the flourishing, not just the surviving, but the flourishing of the society. So that means that even though men may participate in certain things women do not, the women will have no lesser reward in terms of things that they do versus what that men do. And in a hadith not mentioned here, the Prophet ﷺ said, Jihadul mar'ati husnul taba'ul, that the jihad or the struggle of the woman is dealing with her husband. And that's probably much more difficult than fighting any battle on the battlefield. So Islam is equitable, and Islam looks at everyone in an equitable way, but equitable doesn't always mean uniformly. So that also means that people who have been exposed to particular circumstances that are quite difficult will be treated in a way in the afterlife differently from those who had very easy circumstances, will have less of an excuse. And we know that, for example, some of the worst on the Day of Judgment will be the alim And one of the first to be cast off to hellfire will be the so-called scholar who did it not for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but to be pointed at and to be recognized as a scholar. Because they have no less excuse, so to speak, because they know where the truth is, they know what right is, but nonetheless they chose to ignore it. Wallahu a'lam. So, وَلَا تَتَمَنَّ مَا فَضَّلُوا بِهِ بَعْضَهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. So they should not seek or wish for that which already Allah has allotted for each one. And the important thing, وَاسْأَلُوا اللَّهَ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from His fadl, from His virtue and His bounty. Now, to be honest with the audience, I contemplated whether I should go over this next verse or not, but I think it's important that we do look at it. And it's oft quoted, but often in a manner that is misunderstood. And this is the verse of الرجال قوامون على النساء. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم فالصالحات قانتات حافظات للغيب بما حفظ الله واللاتي تخافون نشوزهن فعظوهن واهجروهن في المضاجع واضربوهن فإن أطعنكم فلا تبغوا عليهن سبيلا إن الله كان عليا كبيرا وإن خفتم شقاق بينهما فابحثوا حكما من أهله وحكما من أهلها إن يريدا إصلاحا يوفق الله بينهما إن الله كان عليما خبيرا. So let's look at the words here. First it says الرجال قوامون على النساء. It didn't say الذكران أو الذكور قوامون على الإناث. It didn't say males have this قوامون قيمومية over the females, but rather men. And many of our ulama, especially those who focus on the ihsani aspect of Islam, they say الرجولة مقام. الرجولة مقام. So not maleness, but manhood, which includes chivalry, which includes taking on responsibility, which includes sacrifice, which includes putting others before yourself. These are the meanings of rujula. These are the meanings of being a true man. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed that particular burden upon the men who measure up to be men. They are قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض. So here tafdeel, as we mentioned with the prophets earlier, if you remember at the beginning of Juz 3, تلك الرسل فضلنا بعضهم على بعض. Almost the same words, tafdeel. So tafdeel doesn't mean that one is better than the other. No, it means that they've been given certain things the other has not been given. That is the meaning of tafdeel. And with those certain things that have been given also come certain responsibilities. So men have that particular responsibility. Why so? بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم. There is the illah or the hikmah. وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم. And that which they spent from their wealth. So in a marriage contract, the understanding implicitly, even without it being mentioned, that الرجال قوامون. That means they have to maintain the upkeep of their wives and of their children. And that means they have to give them in a house that's commensurate with the style of living that they were used to before they moved in with the husband, and in terms of food, in terms of maintenance, in terms of lifestyle, all those things have to be taken into consideration. And that's why some of the madhahib, the fiqh madhahib, like the Shafi'i method, talks about this idea of kafa'a, that there has to be some level of commensurability between the man and the woman so that the marriage will survive, and the marriage not will just survive, will thrive, because they have all of these common things between them, and including socio-economic status. While other madhahib, like the madhab of Malik, did not consider it to be an outright criteria or success factor, let's call it that, but it should be taken into consideration, and that is at the discretion of, obviously, the bride and her family about how they want to deal with that particular issue. So what is the role of women in this marriage, or one of the roles? فَالصَّالِحَاتُ قَانِتَاتٌ حَافِظَةٌ لِلْغَيْبِ بِمَا حَفِظَ اللَّهِ. So since they are going to be seen as keepers of the trust, or stewards over the home, and in most marriages, or in many marriages, still the wives are the ones who have the kind of the oversight and the maintenance and the running of the home, oftentimes. So associated with that, الصالحات القانتات حافظة للغيب. They have stewardship in that sense. بِمَا حَفِظَ اللَّهِ, and that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has entrusted to them. Now we get to the controversial part, or so-called controversial part. وَاللَّاتِ تَخَافُونَ نُشُوزَهُنْ فَعِظُوهُنْ. So this nushuz, the ones that you fear nushuz from, it's a difficult word to translate, but it's also used in context with the wife fearing nushuz from the husband. So it doesn't go one way. وَإِنْ خَافَتْ امْرَأَةٌ مِّن بَعْلِهَا نُشُوزًا أَوْ أَعْرَاضًا, which comes later in this juz as well. So if a wife or a woman fears from her ba'al, which is her husband, and nushuz, same word that's used here, أو أعراض, or him turning away from her from other reason, then they can resort to sulh. Then they can resort to reconciliation. And the same thing here. If the husband fears nushuz, in other words, a disruption in the marriage, whereas the marriage has now taken a course where it's in danger of not being sustainable, then these are the steps one can take on the part of the husband. And there are things the husband can do, there are things the wife can do, and then there are things that they can do together, which are all mentioned in these verses, in terms of how to handle disputes and problems within the marriage. So here, this is specifically talking about from the perspective of the husband, which is not the only perspective, but it's one of the perspectives. And this is addressing the husbands. وَاللَّاتِ تَخَافُونَ نُشُوزَهُنْ, at this type of disruption, فَعِظُوهُنْ, talk it out. Maw'idah means to speak, means to have a word, means to state your issue. وَهْجُرُهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ, وَهْجُرُهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ, or you can separate from them in the marriage bed. There's two interpretations of that. Either literally you don't sleep in the same bed, or you refrain from marital sexual relations with the wife at that point. And for most people who've ever been in a marriage dispute, usually what happens, that's actually the first thing to go. Probably by mutual, I would say, distrust or decision. However, here it's stating explicitly in the verse that for the husband, from his perspective, this is one of the things that is licit to do and lawful to do when there is a disruption in the marriage. Then we get to the most controversial word, perhaps, for many in the Quran, وَضْرِبُوهُنْ. So وَضْرِبُوهُنْ also can have various interpretations and connotations. But to be honest, most of the tafsir that we come through will say that it informs some sort of corporal discipline. Darb means darb. Darb means to hit. And then they always say at the end of the verse, غَيْرُ مُبَرَّح், something that does not leave a mark, something that does not cause any physical damage or pain. Our mashayikh, when we studied with them and we looked at this particular verse, the Quran is addressing all people and all times. And from the mafhum, not from the mantuq, from the mafhum in this particular verse is that for the vast majority of women today, if not all of them, وَضْرِبُوهُنْ would not really be effective. Even if it's a symbolic type of, they said with like a toothbrush, a miswak, something as light as that. That's a symbolic gesture, but even that symbolic gesture for most people is not going to work for them. Then it would be haram in that particular case to resort to that because it's not going to be effective. The whole idea here is you do something that's effective. Then the rest of the verse comes, فَإِنْ أَطَعْنَكُمْ فَلَا تَبْغُوا عَلَيْهِنَّ سَبِيلًا. But if you return back to each other, then don't seek anything after that. إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلِيًّا كَبِيرًا. Allah is most high and grand. He sees everything. However, if it still continues, now it's not just at the discretion of the husband. More people have to be involved. فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ شِقَاقَ بَيْنِهِمَا. Shiqaq means now they're actually going to split up. فَبَعَثُوا حَكَمًا مِنْ أَهْلِهِ وَحَكَمًا مِنْ أَهْلِهَا. Then you need to involve other members of the family. So the hakam, literally a judge from the husband's side and a judge from the wife's side. They are the ones who try to reconcile and to resolve the dispute. إِن يُرِيدَا إِصْلَاحًا, يعني the two judges, if they seek reconciliation, يُوَفِّقِ اللَّهُ بَيْنَهُمَا. Then Allah will give them tawfiq and success between the two married people. إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلِيمًا خَبِيرًا. And from my experience dealing with people who are in marriage disputes, very, very few people resort to this method. Most often, you don't even see the word divorce mentioned here. There's no talaq. So to threaten with divorce or to speak of divorce or anything like this, none of that is mentioned in the verses here. And most of the time, many of our men, unfortunately, they do a type of talaq that's bid'i, that's done in the wrong way, that's done as a threat, or done in a fit of anger, or done as a way to discipline. None of those things are halal. All of those things are haram. Rather, if the dispute, as is mentioned here, these are the steps that should be taken. And then once you get other people involved and you try to reach a reconciliation and it's still not working, then after much contemplation and back and forth, and I would say mutual decision, then a divorce can be thought about. Otherwise, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed for us. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. I think we've run out of time, so we'll stop here inshallah. Barakallahu feekum, as'ad Allah awqatukum, wa narakum ala khair, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.